Thank you very much for being here. As we've seen in the last 30 or 40 years, there's been a tremendous rise in the level of mass atrocities and responses, from Cambodia in 1975 to 1977, to Yugoslavia in 1995, to Somalia, to Rwanda, and today to places like Darfur, where mass atrocities are continuing to go on, as well as Iraq. So it's not a historical facet, it's an ongoing challenge to international policy. Recently, the international community has adopted the responsibility to protect guidance, which essentially says that if a nation state cannot protect its citizens from atrocities, the international community has the right to go in and to intervene. What does this mean for the United States? What does this mean for the UN? And not only how do we intervene, but how do we make that commitment to intervene? Most recently, Obama has taken this on and it said, as a presidential hopeful, America deserves a leader who responds forcefully to all genocides. I intend to be that president. And so the current issued national security strategy actually directs the military to prepare planning and contingency planning to address these kinds of situations worldwide. And as such, the U.S. Institute for Peacekeeping and Stability Operations, PKSOI, and the Carr Center at Harvard developed, is in the process of developing guidelines and operational planning for the U.S. military under the MARO Project to undertake a U.S. government response to mass atrocities. And so I'd like to introduce Dwight Raymond, who is a former infantry colonel who's up at the U.S. Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute, to talk to you today about that project and about the handbook. And he's been a senior infantry leader. He's been a professor at West Point, and he has the Bronze Star, the Combat Infantry Badge, the Airborne Ranger and Pathfinder qualification. And I'm saying this for the benefit of our green colleagues over there to understand that he has had quite a lengthy career throughout the world in peacekeeping and in operations. Dwight?
You haven't heard me speak yet. Yeah. It's being obstinate here. Okay, thanks. Well, as Susan mentioned, my name is Dwight Raymond. I retired from the Army a little over a year ago. I now work at the U.S. Army's Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute, which is located at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. One of the things that we do, in addition to focusing on peacekeeping and stability operations, is we interact and collaborate with a lot of other organizations that military organizations don't typically work with. So, for example, the United Nations, the Carr Center in this case, the U.S. Institute of Peace, SCRS, just a broad range. And what we do is we find gaps that we think need to be addressed. We find worthwhile partners and try to help fill those gaps. And the MARO Project is one of these projects. Let's start with a little bit of an assessment about how interventions go or don't go. This is from Yes, Prime Minister, which, if you aren't familiar with it, was just a delightful BBC series in the 1980s, and just a wonderful study of bureaucratic politics in action. And even though it was in a British setting, there's a lot that I think is directly applicable to the U.S. as well. And this was from one of the episodes where they had some sort of international crisis. And I mean, you can get the series on DVD if you're curious or interested. It's well worth the time. But it sort of ties into the theme of Samantha Power's book, A Problem from Hell, where she looks at cases of mass atrocities and genocides over the years, and essentially has the thesis that the U.S. governmental apparatus is geared towards inertia, that it, when confronted with a potential situation, that all the wheels sort of lock up and prevent action rather than taking action. And what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of an overview of the MARO project, and I want to hasten to say that the MARO project is agnostic. We don't say that we should intervene, or we don't say that we shouldn't intervene in this, that, or the other case, but what it focuses on is if a military force is tasked to intervene in a situation to prevent mass atrocities, here are some planning resources that might be helpful. We do have an agenda. By the way, I've got about 25 slides, so as the number in the lower right-hand corner gets higher, I expect morale to improve significantly. A little bit of background. This is the first of 2 slides, but depending upon how you would categorize genocides and mass atrocities, as Susan mentioned, there's been no shortage of incidents over the past 100 years, a little bit plus. And it can be a little bit contentious, perhaps, whether a particular incident appears on the list or doesn't appear on the list. And I don't want to get into that. But the number of incidents, and more importantly, the number of people killed and displaced is absolutely mind-boggling. And it doesn't, the incidents don't stop in the distant past. They continue right up until the present day, as you see. And if you start projecting places around the world, which I'll get into a little bit later on in the presentation, there's every bit of grounds for pessimism that this is still going to be around. And one of the things, and this is again reflected in Samantha Power's book, is that with very few cases, the U.S. has not responded. In fact, the rest of the international community arguably has not responded and allowed these or stood by while these incidents occurred. If you wanted to look at potential examples of U.S. involvement in response, certainly the Iraqi Kurds, perhaps in the latter part of that. Bosnia and Herzegovina, eventually, the airstrikes that we finally took against Serbian leadership and Serbian military forces, I think helped. East Timor, actually a little bit after most of the massacres had occurred, but the international community with a coalition led by the Australians and supported tangentially by the U.S., that arguably was a successful intervention. And depending upon how you want to look at it, Lebanon in 1982, when the Marines went in the second time, it was in response to massacres at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. And arguably, that was kind of a MARO-like mission. And we all know how well that turned out, as the Marines, over time, found themselves caught in the middle of different warring factions, all of which were frustrated that they weren't getting what they wanted to achieve, and the Marines became a convenient target for several of them. So Sarah Sewell, who is at the Harvard University's Carr Center, and was really the founding mother, if you will, of the MARO Project. In 1994, she was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration while Rwanda occurred. And one of her takeaways from that experience was that her perception was that the military was not adequately prepared to conduct a MARO if it were tasked to do so. Now, there's other views on what happened or didn't happen with Rwanda, whether it was a policy maker's failure or was it the military not being able to come up with viable options or whatever. But that was her takeaway from it. And what she wanted to do with the MARO Project was to enable military forces that, if tasked to provide options or to conduct a mission, that they would be better prepared to do it than she thought that they were at that time. So the project started in 2007. Its culmination was the military, or the MARO Planning Handbook, which was published in May of this year, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later. And really, the MARO Project has kind of three prongs that, or three avenues that it is focused on. The one is the U.S. military's preparation, and the MARO Handbook is the important first step on that, but also influencing doctrine and planning efforts and exercises and that sort of thing. The second one is the, not so much on the military side, but on the policy-making side of things. And we're involved with various governmental agencies on that. And the third one is not in the U.S. military or the U.S. government, the rest of the U.S. government, but in the international community, i.e. the United Nations or the African Union, and there's some potential for making progress in that area as well. All right, the context for MARO, and really there's two kind of schools of thought, or two extreme schools of thought on this. The MAROites would say that this is such a unique, completely different operation that there's nothing like it under the sun, and we need a brand new planning method and planning framework and this handbook and so forth. The skeptics would say, sorry, but the military is used to planning and conducting operations in bad circumstances. That's what the military does. And so whether it's mass atrocity or a forest fire or response to an earthquake or a war or whatever the case is, you know, in most respects, MARO is not that much different, or need not be that much different from any expeditionary type of operation. I sort of started on the side of the skeptics, having worked on this project for the year. I kind of find myself kind of in the middle of that band, because I think there's, while a MARO situation is similar to many other kind of complex operations, I think there's enough unique strands associated in these types of cases that when you pull them all together, there is kind of a unique tapestry that is useful to look at holistically. But MARO is arguably related to several other concepts that many of you are probably familiar with. Protection of civilians, which in the United Nations has, and in the U.S. government over the past 10 years has gained a great deal of traction. You know, there's protection of civilians is now written into virtually all UN peacekeeping mandates. The UN is developing doctrine on protection of civilians. There are conferences all over the place on what protection of civilians means and so forth. R2P that Susan addressed, and you know, kind of an interesting question is, well, what is R2P and how's it different from POC? Are they the same thing basically? Are they synonymous? Are they different? And I mentioned to Susan's class this morning that if any of her students are sort of desperate for a research paper topic for next week's paper, that might be a good one to look at, because you know, there is a wide range of interpretations of how POC differs from R2P. And that being the case, is MARO even needed if you got POC and R2P? Not to throw too many acronyms at you, but you know, I am former military after all. Protection of civilians in sort of a narrow sense can be viewed as protection of civilians from violence, and more focused, systematic and widespread violence, and that's kind of where it overlaps with MARO. But POC also can be viewed in a much broader context as well, not necessarily protection against just violence, but protection against other things, protection from the effects of natural disasters, perhaps, protection from health threats, protection from not widespread violence from genocidaires, but from an unsafe environment where women in the village can't go out to find firewood or to get water because bad things will happen to them if they do. Responsibility to protect in the literature about that kind of has a striation of 3 stages. The first one being prevent, second one being respond or react to, and the third one being rebuild. And to the extent that that MARO synchronizes with R2P, MARO tends to focus on the react stage, and I'll get more into that as well. Now, some types of operations that the military is familiar with, that there are some clear MARO overlaps with, NEO, non-combatant evacuation operations. You know, there's some similarities there, arguably. You know, any COIN counterinsurgency efforts that, and we say in our doctrine essentially that that the civilian population, the support of the people, is the center of gravity of a successful counterinsurgency. So if you're going to gain the support of the people, you kind of have to protect them, and if you do that, there's some various very obvious similarities with MARO there, and you know, other types of peace operations and so forth. Now, conceptually, you have you know, if you have these violence curves here, and the perpetrators' escalation curve like this, and at a certain level, we're getting into violence and not just hate media and that sort of thing. And the interveners' escalation curve will, in most cases, lag behind the perpetrators in time, because it takes a while for the intervener to figure out what's going on. It takes a while for the intervener to send forces out there. It takes a while for them to build up the forces. And meanwhile, the perpetrator can kill an awful lot of people in this gap here. Now, at some point, the perpetrator tapers off its level of violence, either because the perpetrator runs out of people to kill, because the intervener gets dominance over the perpetrator, or the perpetrator bows to international opinion, or whatever the case is. But you know, conceptually, this is what's going on. So one of the keys is, how can you sort of disrupt the perpetrator's curve so it isn't a smooth escalation, but maybe it gets disrupted for a variety of reasons? How can you advance the intervener's curve or create the appearance of advancing the intervener's curve to try to minimize this gap here? Now, overlaid on the top are the 6 standard joint U.S. military phases that we use in planning. Shape, Deter, Seize Initiative, Dominate, Stabilize, and Enable Civil Authority. And the sort of intervention, if it were to occur, would largely include the Seize Initiative and the Dominate phase. So you kind of have a before intervention, during intervention, after intervention of 2 phases each. The MARO handbook focuses largely on the intervention part, but the boundaries are intentionally made blurry because a MARO operation could sort of blend into what goes on beforehand and what blends in or what happens afterwards. As Susan mentioned, some U.S. strategy documents do make reference to mass atrocities, and I'll just kind of breeze through these really quickly, but the National Security Strategy that came out this year, the QDR, or the Quadrennial Defense Review, both basically say the military's got to be prepared to respond to mass atrocities. There's a sort of like an intelligence-like assessment that talks about it. The Director of National Intelligence, testifying in front of Congress, addressed it in his testimony earlier this year, and particularly pointed out that Southern Sudan was the most likely case, and that's probably still the case. The Army has something called the Army Operating Concept, and it actually has a fairly extended portion of it devoted to MARO, and specifically uses the M word, which we considered a moral victory, and addresses it as well. So our handbook, which was published as I said, in May earlier, which is downloadable, and at one of the last slides has the website, and you can download it there, or you can Google Car Center, MARO, and you'll probably find it pretty easily as well. But broken down into 3 parts with various annexes. The first part kind of is more conceptual. The second part is designed to be of more practical use to military planners. And let me say that while our primary audience in the document was U.S. military planners, we wanted it to be useful to military planners from other countries, to other governmental planners, and really to anybody who's interested in this subject. And my colleague at the Car Center, she sent it to one of her NGO human rights friends, and he wrote back and said, you know, I read it and I understood 90% of it, which I considered another moral victory as well. The first part, we talk about distinctions of a moral situation, and one of the key things that we emphasize in the handbook is the multi-party aspect of it. And whereas military forces are used to looking at enemy versus friendly as kind of like the main thing that needs to be identified, in a moral situation there's usually at least 4 categories. And as you see there, and then the others category can be further subdivided into 3 categories as well: bystanders, positive influences, and negative influences. And one of the things is that in a moral situation, a particular group or tribe or whatever could shift from one category to another, or in a particular situation, a particular group could be both a victim group as well as a perpetrator group. The other thing is that the others category could be the decisive element in resolving a situation. So if you have a whole lot of bystanders, you don't want them to become the next round of victims. You don't want them to join in with the perpetrators. If you can get them off the fence, so to speak, and become positive influences in a particular situation, that might be a key feature of the plan. And while an intervening force may, sort of think that it's going in for humanitarian motives and to do great and wonderful things, it will not be perceived as impartial by the parties involved. And the perpetrators undoubtedly have policy objectives that the perpetrator thinks are legitimate policy objectives. And maybe anybody would agree that yes, those are legitimate objectives. It's just the means that you're using to go about doing them that's wrong. But an intervention that goes in is now stopping the perpetrator from achieving what he wants to achieve. So that then becomes something that causes the intervener not to be a neutral party, which in most peacekeeping operations, that's what the peacekeepers try to do. Okay, some different implications, and I'm going to just kind of hit on a couple of these, but the power of witness was one of the most important of these. And what this gets at is that for perpetrators, even in a situation where they seem to have absolute power in their countries, they're usually very concerned about keeping what they're doing secret, because they know that what they're doing is wrong, is shameful, or whatever the case is. And even Nazi Germany during the Holocaust in the early 40s, 1942, 1943, when everybody thought that the Germans were going to win the war and there was nothing that could be done to stop them, even then they were very secretive about the final solution and what was going on at the extermination camps, and forbidding their soldiers from taking pictures and all that, and developing code words for special actions and so forth and so on. And so the power of witness, especially in preventing a mass atrocity situation, can be a very effective tool in keeping a crisis from escalating. One of the issues, the symptoms versus the causes, and this is this kind of gets into what does the force do if it intervenes? Does it go in and stop the killing and then leave? Or does it go in and stop the killing and then work on the problems that caused the killing to begin with? Because you don't want to intervene today, stop the killing, only to have to go back in next Thursday because it's started up again. So that's one of the issues. As we get into part 2 of the book, we take the military's approach to really operational design, which has 3 steps. One is understanding the operating environment, and so we provide a lot of considerations on the political, military, economic, social, infrastructure, informational considerations that and how they might relate to a MARO case, as well as the actors, the 4 categories that I talked about before. So you understand the operating environment. You have to frame the problem based upon the strategic guidance that the force gets or doesn't get, which could be the case, and then develop the concept of operations to address the problem. And that's kind of how the handbook is laid out. We talk a little bit about how a MARO force might be organized, and essentially you have the headquarters with a land element, probably an air element, a maritime element, special operations, and logistics. And this is, there's nothing too brilliant there. That's pretty much normal. And then how it ties in with other potential military partners. If there's a UN peacekeeping force in the area, for example, what's the relationship there with other civilian agencies, like from the U.S. government, and who it reports to. And so there's a lot of complications associated with it. It looks pretty straightforward and clean, but this could often be the hardest part of an operation, not so much, deciding where units are going to maneuver and all that, but figuring all this stuff out. In looking at courses of action or how the military forces might be employed, we look at it in 2 parts. First, in the employment of what we call flexible deterrent options, and that's really before the intervention, how military forces might be used to really keep the situation from turning into a crisis. And FDOs might have any of the categories that you see there, again, with the emphasis on deterring the problem or deterring the perpetrator so that the problem doesn't get worse. And we put in in one of the annexes a wide range of suggestions for these FDOs. We grade them from low level to mid level, depending upon level of resources that are involved, the risk that would be associated with doing some of these actions, and the degree to which the host nation's sovereignty gets infringed upon. Because in a lot of these cases, the government in the country could be the perpetrator or could be basically orchestrating the mass atrocities. Now, when we get into the intervention itself, we identify 7 main approaches that could be adopted. I know the print is hard to read, so I'll just read them out. But the first one's saturation. Second one's oil spots. Third one is separation. Fourth one is safe areas. Partner enabling is 5th. Containment is 6th. And then attack perpetrators is the 7th. And we have these little cartoons that sort of depict how they might be operationalized. Now, I'll just talk about each of these briefly. But the saturation approach up over here, that's kind of like what we've been doing in Iraq for several years, where you have you have the area that you're interested in, you divide it into sectors, and then you have units assigned to those sectors. And so one unit is responsible for securing this area over here, another unit's responsible for securing this area over here, and stopping mass atrocities and so forth in those areas. And if you have sufficient force and a small enough area, that may be an appropriate way of doing it and assigning tasks to the organizations. Now, what's been called the oil spot strategy, kind of from classic counterinsurgency strategy, it's also called clear, hold, build, or shaped clear, hold, build, a little bit more current manifestation of it. But the idea here is you really don't have enough force. You don't have enough force to secure all of the area at once adequately. So use the oil spot approach or clear, hold, build. So you pick selected key areas and you focus on those initially. You clear them of the perpetrators. Then you hold the area, make sure you have enough capability, and you start building capacity. And then once you've done that and you're able to, then you expand to other areas and basically continue the process. So a little bit more deliberate and a little bit more systematic than what you have here. Okay, another conceptual approach is the separation approach, where if you have a region that's primarily perpetrators, say over here, another region that's primarily victims, then it might be effective to establish essentially a buffer or a cordon between the two and just keep them away from each other so that they can't be doing all those mass atrocities and whatnot. And if you sort of visualize, for those of you on my right here who've been to the DMZ in Korea, you might visualize something along the lines of that. Safe areas would be if you have victim groups that are concentrated in particular areas like refugee camps perhaps, or in certain villages, that maybe you adopt a defensive posture and focus on protecting them, or maybe protecting the migration routes that displaced civilians might be moving down, but not much more than that. The containment approach, and I'd suggest that the airstrikes that were used in conjunction with Bosnia might be an illustration of that. But here, what you do is essentially establish an expectation of behavior on the part of the perpetrator forces, and if they transgress, you whack them. And you whack them in a way that they decide they don't want to do that anymore. So if for example, you've said that you will stay on this side of this line and not come into this area, and if they do, maybe airstrikes or special operating forces or other means can be used against them. The attacking perpetrators approach is the most offensive of any of these approaches, and it most likely assumes that you have sufficient force that you can defeat the perpetrators' capabilities, whether it's it may be sufficient to take out their leadership, change their regime, if you will, or maybe you have to go after military capabilities as well. But the emphasis here is on basically defeating the perpetrators' capabilities to operate in the future, whereas this one is more affecting the perpetrators' decision-making calculus. This is actually affecting their capability. And the seventh approach, which I didn't draw a little cartoon for, the enabling partners, or the partner enabling, that would be not so much U.S. forces that are on the ground, but somebody else that maybe we are providing support to. And East Timor was an example of that because it was the Australians who led a coalition, and the U.S. involvement was pretty marginal. In some cases in Africa, perhaps, partners that could be enabled could be the African Standby Force under the African Union, some other African militaries, maybe a UN peacekeeping mission. So UNMISS in southern Sudan, for example, could be a partner. In some cases, maybe you enable the victim groups themselves so that they're able to defend themselves. Now, these approaches aren't mutually exclusive, and in our handbook we talk about circumstances under which it might be more appropriate to do this one, say, as opposed to this one or this one. And it could be that there's a temporal differentiation. So early on in the intervention, since you don't have a whole lot of forces on the ground, maybe the containment is all that you can do using airstrikes because there's nothing else there. And then maybe you can move on to another approach in one area and a different approach in another one. But so they can be kind of packaged together in accordance with the circumstances. And each of these has certain advantages and disadvantages. For example, if you do this oil spot approach, maybe you do a good job of securing the victim groups in these areas here, but if you're a victim who happens to be living out here someplace, you know, there's not much that's being done to help you. So, and all of these have drawbacks to them as well as their advantages. I'm going to kind of skip over the next few slides because I'm feeling merciful, but we offer various planning frameworks that commands can use to structure their approaches and, you know, offer military objectives and what we call lines of effort. That should be necessary and sufficient. That if you do all these lines of effort right, you're probably going to succeed. If you screw up any of these lines of effort, you know, you're apt to fail. And what we try to do in the book is to provide organizations kind of the 70% solution, if you will, that in sort of a generic sense, they could take what we give them, adjust it, modify it, add a few things, drop a few things, and be not too far off from where they need to be. I mentioned the 6 standard joint phases, and this kind of explains a little bit more detail how they might apply. So if you take Southern Sudan as a scenario, okay, the 9th of June or 9th of January coming up, there's going to be a referendum on whether Southern Sudan secedes from the rest of the Sudan, and then what happens to the Abyei region in between the two Sudans, which has a whole bunch of oil. And so because of that referendum, there's a fairly high expectation that there could be lots of violence and orchestrated mass atrocities that could manifest themselves in a variety of ways. There's at least 3 different scenarios, but I won't go into that. Won't go into that now. Now, this mass atrocity scenario isn't going to happen, we don't think, tomorrow or the next day or next week or whatever. But as we get closer to January 9th, it's very possible. So the shape phase is basically now until things start getting out of hand or the indications and warnings are that a crisis is emerging. And so in the shape phase, you know, there are potentially some things that we, the U.S., the international community, can do to dampen the possibility that the crisis will even happen. Then once we do start getting indications and warnings that, you know, hate speeches are starting to crank up and acts of violence are starting to escalate, then we're kind of in the deter phase, where which includes the crisis management, the use of some of the FDOs that we talked about before, and then at some point there may be the decision to intervene militarily, and then we get into the 2 main phases as far as the MARO is concerned, and then what happens afterwards. But I think in many cases, this sort of standard military joint phasing construct can fit a MARO case. You know, you don't want to force it too much if it doesn't, but we suggest that in many cases that it will work. This is just another framework that kind of lays out the phasing in a little bit more detail, and if you want to download the handbook and take a look at it, more power to you. But it has you know, the different objectives for the different phases, the different activities that would go on the different phases, basically a little bit more detail over what I just described. All right, about 2 or 3 more slides, and the last slide doesn't have anything. Some of the other MARO things that we have going on, we've got a conference in December in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Dr. Merrill's going to be going to that, and if you're interested, you can go onto our website and find out more information about that. Well, actually, the next slide has a little bit more information about it. We've started doing some tabletop exercises with some military commands. UCOM has been particularly proactive in incorporating this. Kind of skip over the other things, and just one person's view of a list of potential scenarios that this could apply, and there are probably others out there. I mentioned the conference on MARO, day and a half. All you need to do is pay your own transportation and lodging, and we'll give you meals and give you lots of entertainment. Have a combination of plenary sessions as well as some working groups to focus on more discrete areas like policy and intelligence and so forth. Website for registration, and that's pretty much all I have. I welcome any questions or discussions or argument. Our website is down in the bottom right, and over on the left is the Carr Center at Harvard's website, where you can download the handbook if you are so inclined. I mentioned in Susan's class earlier, if you read it from cover to cover, probably takes about 3 hours to do so, and obviously could be scanned in much less time. Sir.
I'm Chris Lamro here with the Center for the Study of Europe. How well accepted is this by the U.S. military, all services, and our allies?
Within the U.S. military, there's kind of a mixed review, I think. There was initially, when it was kind of in the conceptual stage, there was probably more pushback that we already know how to do this stuff, or we can figure it out if we need to. There are a lot of people that would tend to approach it in that respect. But I think there's growing acceptance of it, particularly now that we got the handbook published, and those that have looked at it seem to like it. So it's gaining more credibility. And I think that pretty much applies across the services. There's been well, one of the people in PKSOI just came back from a visit to the United Nations, and he said that it's starting to gain traction there, and they're very enthusiastic about it as well. So I think the initial steps have been made, and it's starting to gain more currency. So I'd say it's my assessment of its acceptance is better now than maybe 8 months ago before we had the handbook published, because we were getting a lot of pushback then. Yeah, in the back, please.
Sky Herrick, International Relations major. What are the biggest inhibitors to an actual MARO in Southern Sudan or areas like that?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question, because a lot of the skeptics, including in the military and elsewhere, could say that really this isn't the important thing that is needed. That every soldier that deploys, or every soldier in the U.S. Army, could have the MARO handbook memorized. They could have their personal copy. They could have it on their iPhone, and they could be ready to go. But unless there's political will or a political decision or an effective political process to decide to intervene, it's all for naught. So now some would say, if the military is shows that it's more capable of responding, then maybe that might help policymakers make an informed decision. So there is admittedly that relationship, but I think not a few people would say that really the main issue is the policy-making world, not in the implementation world. And you had a question, sir?
Yeah, my name is Paul Russell. I'm an IR major as well. My question goes along the same lines. You said that this handbook doesn't really take a position as far as whether we should go in or not.
Right.
So it's more of a personal opinion question. Do you feel like the U.S. should be involved more readily in areas such as Sudan or the Congo? And if so, what should we do?
Yeah. What I would hope that we do is that we are more involved early on so that a major intervention isn't necessary. I kind of ask myself, I've got a son who's a Marine lieutenant, and ask myself, would it be worth him going to some place where arguably people have been killing each other for years and will continue to do so? And it's a tough question to answer. Intuitively, I think we need to be we should do what we can to stop these sorts of tragedies on this scale from occurring. But I think the answer is to do it not preemptive, that's a loaded term, but to do so early on to prevent the problem from occurring to begin with. So there are things that could be done now, for example, with respect to Southern Sudan, rather than wait until January 10th and then reacting then. Any other questions? Yeah.
My name's Devin Wagstaff, and I'm a business law major. And I mean, you mentioned a lot about preventative or being there and kind of trying to shape the problem before it occurs. What specifically, I'm really interested in how business plays a part in repairing these types of conflicts or preventing them. What role would you say that business economies, essentially the argument that I've heard is, where there's good business and people are prospering, there's less incentive for unrest and destruction. What role do you think that business leaders can play in complementing or paralleling these types of principles in these countries?
Yeah. When we talk about the different lines of effort, one of them is the social welfare, which includes not just feeding starving people, but developing economic opportunity and basically a positive lifestyle. So we do talk about that in the handbook, and this is more and more a part of U.S. military doctrine as well. That it's not just focusing on the military thing, but you got to focus on the governance and the economic development and the rule of law and all those other aspects as well. Because if you don't, then the people aren't being provided for, they don't have what they need. And if the people don't have what they need, you don't have the popular support. And if you don't have the popular support, you don't have the security. So there is this very linked relationship between all those different dimensions. So, I think for businesses outside of the country of interest, obviously if they can be incentivized to provide direct foreign investment, that can help redress a problem situation. We identify in the handbook that some key business leaders within the country may be very important actors that have to be engaged with as well and can't be overlooked. So I think pretty much across the board in the military, not just in the MARO situation, but in any sort of stability operation, there's a recognition that the business angle is very key.